thanks again for the invitation to present. I'm in a place that I know that none of the rest of you are in because there are only 19 other people in this town. It's called Mitamita. It's a far northeast of Victoria, and we've retreated rapidly to this part of the world in about March when they shut the universities in Melbourne, and our kids have either been going to the local school, which has been a little bit entertaining, coming from Fitzroy to the kind of back waters of Mitamita, where there have been 8 other students in the classroom with them, and they're in the classroom together, which has also been rather challenging for the 2 of them. But yeah, this is Yaitmathang country, the Dadaroa language group, and maybe I can just, I don't know if you can see that. I'll turn it around. You can see our view there out the back. That's a hill called Nunganya, which is it's one of these times when the Aboriginal word is just so much more pleasant than the colonisers decided to call it Mount Misery, which I really have no idea why they chose that name. But it actually, you can't see it from the angle that I gave you then, but it actually is, and we've discovered that the word Nunganya actually means pregnant woman. And the hill is beautiful because you can actually see the pregnant belly and then her kind of breast and her head. And it's, being able to look out on that rather than the kind of hectic streets of Fitzroy has been really very privileged, to be honest. So today I was asked to kind of talk about the cities research that we do and how it relates to biodiversity conservation. But just to quickly start, I don't know, many of you probably already know most of these people in this picture, but the Icon Science Research Group, there are a few additions now, of course, but this is from a couple of years ago when we were allowed to do this kind of hugging thing, which seems like, I don't know when we're going to be able to do it again. But yes, we went to Lorne on the coast for our lab retreat, which is really, really fun. But yeah, we were kind of interesting group of people ranging from architects to marketing, political scientists, lawyer, there's a couple of hardcore planners, urban planners, lots of ecologists, there's a physicist or 2. So a really interesting and a fairly eclectic group of people. And I suppose what we really try and do is just apply whatever method is necessary to attack a kind of environmental or, particularly conservation problems. So we do a lot of work in the understanding of kind of human behaviours and psychology of product choice. I heard that Carissa just got a feature fellowship on sustainable seafood, and that's really exciting. It'd be great to interact with you more, Carissa, because we've had a bit of a project going on sustainable kind of meat consumption, and now just got a linkage grant looking at sustainable coffee consumption, and how you kind of change supply chains so that everyday activities like drinking a cup of coffee can be something that people link back to their impacts on the natural world and on biodiversity. Because we know it does have massive impacts, but it's not, we know that switching the light switch off is going to be good for climate change, and turning off the tap is good for water consumption, but we really want to make those everyday activities linked also to biodiversity conservation. But as I said, today I'm really focusing on the work that we do sort of at the intersection of architecture, urban design, landscape architecture, and biodiversity conservation. And I actually just want to start with a little anecdote because I think it highlights how much this space has moved and shifted in the last kind of probably even 5 years. And it's to do with an invitation I got to be part of a group of experts who met on Zoom to advise the ABC about an augmented reality project that they're doing as part of this new 3-part series that's going to come out on big weather and how to survive it. And this group of experts were asked to dream up what a truly resilient regional city would look like. And that's kind of in the face of all the things that we know on our doorstep, or actually even here: fires, floods, storm surges and the like, droughts, cyclones. But, also together with all the stresses of kind of just being in a city. This image is probably maybe more familiar to you guys, but certainly we haven't seen people together like that in Melbourne for a very long time. but yeah, that whole idea that exponential population growth leads to a lot of stress and anxiety in a city, and whether it's because of this or, you know, as we're currently seeing, I think there's stress and anxiety just from having to be isolated from one another and to go about your everyday existence without interacting with other people. But all these things I think have really highlighted that we need to carefully plan and think about our cities if we're not going to have a whole bunch of really dysfunctional, stressed out and anxious people living in them. And so they invited fire chiefs and engineers and planners and flooding experts and the like. And I suppose, I think they anticipated, I certainly anticipated that we were going to be really focused on, you know, smart city solutions and technological kind of solutions to all of these problems that cities face. But actually a really surprising outcome was that we focused almost the entire conversation talking about nature-based solutions. We talked about rooftop gardens and urban forests to, you know, to lower the temperature in cities and to, you know, to clean stormwater and slow it down, mangroves and wetlands to counter and buffer storm surge. We talked about fire being a natural part of a city landscape. You know, how do you use vegetation in a clever way to actually reduce fire risk and to, you know, strategically plant vegetation, the right type of vegetation, to try and kind of reduce the risk of infrastructure damage and the like. And we also talked about just, you know, the need in terms of human resilience to have everyday nature as part of the lived experience in a city. And I think certainly this is a reflection of people's COVID experiences of being in lockdown. And, you know, it's actually really shone a light, I think, on the equity around nature access. You know, those who have it and those who don't are really feeling this very differently. And so, you know, it's unfair if people can't access nature right outside their houses. And that should be just recognised, not just as a kind of something that is a problem in isolation, but as a sort of, as a kind of broad kind of concern for city design. And it's also, I think, really recognised that this type of thinking of having everyday nature experiences is one of our best ways of actually encouraging that stewardship of nature that we all know we need in the world of biodiversity conservation. So yeah, I think relatively quickly the world has shifted from thinking about nature in cities as a really sort of peripheral, nuanced, kind of pretty out there concept, which is definitely how it was considered when I first started working in this space, to it now being really mainstream. In fact, the main way that these fire chiefs and the like were talking about building resilient cities. So it's a very mainstream consideration now. And if you look around you, there's massive interest in the planning and design professions, and also just in research, in kind of funding the kind of research to really enhance this type of you know, thinking of for city design. And that's because we're starting to recognise that it's not just about the climate change future proofing, but we know now, and Rich Fuller's work has been really key in kind of highlighting this, that the health and wellbeing benefits for people, now, intriguingly, are sort of intimately linked to how much and what type of exposure we get to nature on an everyday basis, ranging from our kind of risk of asthma and allergies through to, you know, the cognitive development of our children and our kind of, obviously, our mental health and wellbeing, which I think some people have keenly felt, certainly in Melbourne. So there are a whole bunch of really compelling reasons for wanting to build resilient cities in a way that really embraces nature. Oops. And as I said, there's massive global investment in this space. And so this is a slide here that I've got of Urban Green Up, which is a European Commission funded project that I'm lucky to be a CI on. And this is a project that I think is about 36 million euros. And what they're doing is action research. They're building nature-based solutions in cities around Europe. So in Turkey, in Spain and in England. And they're measuring and testing and evaluating these solutions and kind of really, I suppose, refining our understanding of what is it actually, what are the best ways of planting to kind of decrease temperatures in Valladolid in Spain? What are the best ways of planting to increase retail strip productivity in Liverpool? That's actually that's a key question that we're trying to address. They want to rejuvenate Liverpool's economy using nature-based solutions. What are the best ways of planting to deliver those kind of incredible health benefits that we have correlative studies around? But now we need to put that into tangible design recommendations. It's these species, this type of kind of arrangement, this is the exact exposure that we need. We need to kind of have that sophistication in the recommendations that we're giving to designers and architects and the like. Oh, one of the really interesting studies that I've been involved in is looking at how you use nature-based solutions to reduce isolation in cities. So particularly amongst vulnerable groups that might not be able and have the capacity to interact with people and, you know, in an everyday way. So that's one of 4 similarly funded European Commission projects. So, you know, massive investment. They want to be global leaders in how you design and implement nature-based solutions. And there wouldn't be many cities around that don't have some reference to this in their kind of, you know, high-level strategic documents and the like. So much activity. I'm really interested in how that intersects with biodiversity conservation, because of course there's a risk, as Nat and others kind of highlighted in this really great paper that we collaborated on, that you can build a city with lots and lots of trees, but with very little benefit to biodiversity. You see that all around Melbourne, everywhere is occupying them. And that's because these activities are rarely linked to biodiversity. And that's what Natalie showed in this study, was that you know, green infrastructure is the 3rd most popular way of adapting to climate change that cities are really embracing, but very few of them actually talk about biodiversity in these strategies. So a massive potential missed opportunity. It's a shame because of this, because we know that we stand to lose a lot of biodiversity. This is a study that we, again, a few of you in the room potentially collaborated on a few years ago. We kind of analysed where the threatened species are in Australia, and showed that species on the edges of and in cities are at much higher densities, or 3 times, I think, the densities of species in threatened species in rural areas. So they're kind of disproportionately important places to think about threatened species. These are some of the kind of species around. We don't have koalas, obviously, sadly. This is the bandicoot is probably a most charismatic you know, bit of wildlife that we have in Melbourne. I mean, powerful owl's pretty charismatic, I suppose, but, you know, we've got the Frankston spider orchid, that if we don't protect it in Frankston is basically doomed. The growling grass frog, lots of these species are highly city dependent. We know that there are ecosystems around Australia that are, you know, very, very currently threatened by housing development and city expansion. This is the Basalt Plains grassland, of which I'm a big fan, in around Melbourne. Less than 1% of it left. I believe it's actually Australia's most endangered ecosystem. It's rammed full of threatened species. Unfortunately, you have to put your bum in the air and your head to the ground to actually appreciate its beauty and magnificence, and be there at the right time of the year, or it might look like a bit of a, you know, brown kind of paddock, I suppose, which, you know, doesn't sort of, needs a bit of a image makeover probably in some respects. But, you know, and actually, interestingly, I think people have said in the past that, you know, there's less than 1% of it left. Most of it is left is still on private land in these kind of, you know, dilapidated kind of settings with industrial zones all around them, and you know, really sort of not in its kind of peak kind of point of appreciation. And, you know, I heard someone say once that it's taking someone to these kinds of tiny urban remnants that are kind of weed filled and surrounded by industry, It's a bit like taking someone to, you know, a clapped out bit of rainforest on the edge of a kind of, you know, of a dairy farm that's actually kind of regen and, you know, it's full of weeds, and sort of saying, here's a rainforest, you know, don't you love it? So unfortunately, we don't have many beautiful, compelling examples of this ecosystem, but it really is going to probably go extinct unless, because it is mostly still on private land. There's hardly any of it on public land, and most of it is in a growth corridor of Melbourne. This is the Cumberland Plains around Sydney. Again, a really critically endangered ecosystem, hardly any of it left. And they've just signed off on a strategic assessment to clear another 10,000 hectares of this ecosystem as a part of, you know, Sydney's strategic growth. But it's okay because they're going to offset it. This is the Swan Coastal Plain around Perth. Again, a really endangered, and this is one of the world biodiversity hotspots. And between 1994 and 2003, over 120,000 hectares of this ecosystem were cleared for housing development, and many, many more tens of thousands of hectares, again, planned for clearing. Under the strategic, but again, it, you know, has many threatened species and ecosystems. I believe this is a coastal salt marsh. Please, Jonathan, tell me if I'm incorrect. I think this is actually a photo of the Toondah Harbour, which may be an issue that is dear to some of your hearts, but, you know, it's a really clear example of a kind of critically endangered ecosystem. I think at least endangered ecosystem that is in the path of kind of, you know, really substantial sort of urban development. In fact, there was a really interesting study that the ACF, the Australian Conservation Foundation, put out a few weeks ago that was called Extinction in Australian Cities or something. And they popped Brisbane at the top of the list of places in cities and towns in Australia that have lost the most amount of threatened species habitat between, maybe it was 2000 and 2017, I think. I can't remember the dates actually, you'd have to look that up to confirm, but it was something like that. Unfortunately, I looked at the kind of fine print of this report, and they didn't include grasslands in their analysis here, so which probably goes to show how much this ecosystem needs a kind of image makeover. Even the Australian Conservation Foundation, based in Melbourne, didn't actually acknowledge that the grasslands were an ecosystem of threat. But anyway, if you included grasslands, I think probably Melbourne might actually top Brisbane's kind of tally there. But nevertheless, we're all in the same boat. All of our cities around Australia have got these critically endangered ecosystems right there on our doorsteps that we are kind of, we're continuing to clear at really alarming rates. So we stand to lose a lot of biodiversity without sort of more strategic thinking in this space. We also stand to lose a lot in terms of all those benefits that I described earlier. So we know that, and you know, Rich Fuller's work has kind of demonstrated this wholeheartedly, that more diverse native species in cities is good for people as well. So we know that it's better in terms of the cognitive development that I mentioned. It's better in terms of the allergy responses that I mentioned. And this is a really interesting study that came out of the University of Adelaide recently that showed that planting diverse native species in parks leads to a more diverse and beneficial biota in the soil, which leads to improved immune system response of the humans that interact with those spaces. And this is the kind of study I think is going to be really important in convincing planners that, you know, plane trees are not the only way of actually of greening our cities, and that there's some real benefit in using native diverse vegetation. We also know that native diverse vegetation is more resilient to drought and insect attack. But I think there's something that's really missed in a lot of this discussion, and that is only really revealed when you work a lot in the urban planning and design space, and that is that biodiversity and native vegetation have massive potential in actually doing something that we all really want in planning and design, and that is to create a sense of place. And the fact that biodiversity is something that you recognise. You get off a plane, if this is ever going to happen again, after being overseas, and you come out and you can smell the air and you can hear the sounds and you can see the vegetation, and it's the vegetation, the biodiversity and the sounds and the smells of it that really are so evocative. And we need to draw on that and use it to create uniqueness in our cities as well, and that sense of place that's really quite important to planners and designers. It's also one of our best opportunities to engage, what I call it, to re-enchant people with nature. One of the kind of best outputs, research outputs, if you want to call it that I feel really proud of, is this little book that we wrote that came out of a survey of the insects of Melbourne, the little things that run the city. And it's just beautiful illustrations of Melbourne's insects and some lovely descriptions of the types of their kind of lifestyles and the like. And children around Melbourne and actually Victoria use this book a lot. It sold so many copies, it's ridiculous. And I think it's a really important way of actually this idea of having nature in cities is so critical in that kind of in that aspect of of really being able to re-enchant people and enliven their kind of imaginations when it comes to nature. There's obviously a really key role in connecting people to Indigenous history and culture as well. And the City of Melbourne, we've been working with them for a while now, but they're really interested in bringing species back to the city that might have been lost for a while, or that have certainly aren't dominating in the landscapes. Species that have significant cultural stories, so telling cultural stories through the vegetation and species that we have in our landscapes. This murnong, the yam daisy, a really important food source in Melbourne, or this common brown butterfly that once used to emerge at the start of one of the 7 Wurundjeri seasons. Massive numbers, imagine that. Here's that season, it's arrived because this butterfly is back. Slightly tangential, but this is a project that I feel really kind of proud of, actually, that was funded by the Threatened Species Hub. And it was working with traditional owners to bestow schools with totem species that they can really connect to spiritually, bringing that kind of spiritual element back into conservation that I think we kind of don't rely on much in our communications, but I think to our detriment. Connecting, understanding that looking after that species means that that species is also going to look after you. So working with kids to kind of, and the traditional owners, to develop a totem for the species, for the school, planting habitat for those species, and understanding what it would take to actually bring a species back to the site through kind of ecological understanding. And then, obviously generating that biodiversity in school spaces that we know is critical for cognitive development and the like. And then at the same time, really generating, and we know this through the evaluation that we've done, a deep appreciation and respect for Indigenous culture as something that has, relevance alongside sort of, Western science in the school curriculum. Anyway, that was a little bit of an aside, but essentially this vision I'm painting of cities enriched with nature, where we're bringing species back, we're delivering enchantment of nature, you're actually creating places that people can learn to be stewards and can really have a deep appreciation for nature and all the benefits that it brings. That is not going to happen without some big changes to the way we do things. And we also need some intentional strategies that are going to link ecological and scientific understanding to the design and planning process in a profound kind of way. Because this is actually the reality of how we do a lot of development in this country still. And I know probably plenty of you have seen this billboard picture that I've presented before, but it just, to me, summarises kind of really the current status of the development industry. And actually, believe me, there are developers now who are doing different stuff. And it actually gives me a hell of a lot of hope working with some of the kind of leading developers in the field, that this is not necessarily the kind of way that we are doing things everywhere now, and that people are kind of waking up to the fact that biodiversity can be a sort of an asset as to a development site. But the way that we develop our cities on the whole in Australia is not actually conducive to delivering those everyday nature experiences. We do this terrible urban fringe style development. This is actually a critically endangered grassland behind this barbed wire fence across the road from this housing estate here, beautifully kind of engaging the residents of this place, not. I'm not sure if that's actually artificial turf, but some of these streetscapes have artificial turf, concrete, pebbles. There's not even, I can't even see a weed on this property. There's not a single kind of bit of biodiversity that one could set eyes upon in this kind of design. People will press their button, drive into this driveway, shut it behind them, go into their home cinema. Even if there was a park nearby that they could go and enjoy nature, they're not going to probably have the time to do it because they'll be commuting for, an hour and a half to get to the city to work and back, not have actually time in their day to do it, and certainly not encouragement in terms of the urban form. This is bad urban form for engaging people with nature. Even though it's often on the signage that, we're going to have, they might name the streets after the species that used to exist in these sites. I don't know if you've seen that. It's really bloody depressing. This is the other really kind of classic form of urban development that we have in this country, the kind of massive high rises in the middle of the city. Again, sometimes it's sort of apartment sizes that actually are smaller than some of the apartments that you see in average apartment sizes that are smaller than Hong Kong, believe it or not. We have very poor kind of planning regulations around the apartment design in this country. And again, very hard for people to actually engage with streetscape or nature in these places. I mean, there's no effort that goes into that, of course, but even if you did make an effort, it would be really hard to construe a kind of really positive nature experience in these places. There's actually a really interesting planning phenomenon that if you live on a kind of, I think about maximum of about 6 stories, you need to be able to look out your window or stand on your balcony and yell at your kids, apparently, is the way that you know that you can be connected to streetscape. And we kind of translate into that, into thinking that's the way that you're actually going to be able to be connected to nature as well. So we think that there's a really important role to link urban form to nature connectedness in cities. And this is my least favourite actually of all 3, if you had to say it, is this kind of knock down and rebuild that you have, which is in the middle rings of our suburbs, where you have, a kind of old Queenslander or the like on a 1/4 acre block. You knock it down, you put in 2, usually it's just 2 townhouses or maybe one other big one. It's a poor solution in terms of yield, in planning yield, in terms of the number of people you fit into a suburb. Very few extra people fitted into a suburb, but massive impacts usually on the street biodiversity and on the yard biodiversity, because people fill it up from tip to bottom with kind of these massive houses that then they'd have to clean. That's what I often worry and wonder about. How do you kind of go around cleaning 4 bathrooms, etc.? Anyway, the point I'm making is urban form needs a rethink. We also need a rethink in our planning legislation and our planning policies, because at the moment, nature is framed as a problem, something to be dealt with. It's called a planning constraint layer, the biodiversity constraint layer. And, that doesn't actually make you think, oh, this is here we have an asset that we really need to plan to maximise. No, it makes you think, here's a problem that's going to give us a real bit of grief and that we need to kind of try and get rid of and offset somewhere else. And so that's exactly what happens, of course. So much of our urban habitat is knocked down for housing development, but then we're all convinced that it's okay because it's going to be offset elsewhere. And actually, we know, because we've just done a study on this around Perth, that the offset sites are much further away from people than the impact sites. So we're literally ripping our native heritage, our natural heritage, out of our cities and offsetting it far away from where people exist. So it's the opposite of what I'm talking about. Offsetting is so not the solution in this space in any way, shape or form. And of course, it totally denies the fact that most biodiversity values are place-based. We know that this is a tree on the side of a road that they're going to be expanding to a sort of dual carriageway in Western Victoria, a birthing tree. So a tree that generations and generations of Aboriginal women have given birth in, and they're talking about offsetting it. That's absolutely ludicrous. How can you offset a tree like this? It's absolutely not possible. And that, to me, is the problem, you know, totally epitomised. But even offsetting, you know, I'm not going to go on about this because it's really my absolute pet hate, but let's just say, and I know some of you have seen this before, but it just, to me, captures the problem in essence. This is a satirical website called Cheat Neutral. You can offset your cheating by paying these people to abstain from cheating. And so therefore the net happiness of the world will be, you know, kind of about even. And to me, this captures the kind of whole concept of offsetting. It's ethically bankrupt, and it's not delivering anything in terms of biodiversity, or certainly not in terms of that everyday nature experience that we know we need in cities. No, we need this. We need a biodiversity banking system, and we call it these days onsets. We just got a discovery grant to look at this concept of onsets, which is really exciting. How do we actually do true sustainable development in places where we're not going to just destroy biodiversity and you know, pay indulgences and get it to be kind of established somewhere else? No, we're actually going to make the effort to design carefully to actually enhance biodiversity. God knows we've got enough clapped out crappy sites in the world to actually develop there and enhance on-site biodiversity. And so that's what we developed this protocol called Biodiversity Sensitive Urban Design, to do exactly that in cities, to actually enhance on-site biodiversity and do it in a way that actually really reflects the science of conservation and ecology. So linking design to species and ecosystem persistence. And it's actually a sort of a pretty kind of, I suppose it's a fairly standard approach to thinking about nature that would be familiar to all of you, but it's not familiar. Even to landscape architects, you'll be so horrified to know that how little ecological literacy many of these disciplines, including landscape architects, have. They don't know ecology. It's really quite bizarre. Start by investigating your site. So, and all of these steps might sound familiar to you, but they're a bit different, because in cities, and because you know that in a way you're doing this as much for people as for the biodiversity of the site, you have to think a bit differently. Investigating your site. So we would know you'd normally just look at what species exist there. What are the threatened species? What are the ecosystems? What's the vegetation? But let me take you a step forward. Let's actually think about what used to be there. What are the species that you could bring back to this site? What were the culturally significant species? What happened? What happened previously in terms of meeting places for people and significant cultural events that you could try and sort of reflect again in your design? Next step is identifying your biodiversity objectives. And again, this is probably familiar but different. So you want to be really specific, thinking about, you know, threatened species you'd want to protect. Obviously, there's going to be legislation around that. Don't offset it, protect it on site. And then are there things that you want to bring back? Charismatic species, species that are culturally significant, species that provide key services, for example, like, designed to kind of enhance immunity, or designed to prevent insect kind of disease. You can do this. But you know, really interestingly, our experience has been that people don't think in this way necessarily. I mean, sure, they can understand legislation, but you need to actually take them on a journey to really understand how to design a good biodiversity objective. One that actually includes a lot of different elements, whether it's the cultural significance, social acceptability, ecological feasibility, conservation value, economic utility. But actually, you know, often you're in a room. This is my experience. This is what happened to us recently with the Fisherman's Bend site. It's a huge urban renewal project in the city of Melbourne. that used to be where a lot of kind of industry, I think the Holden site was there, and a bunch of other industry, that is now going to be turned into 160,000 new homes. So really Australia's biggest urban renewal project, and, you know, an industrial wasteland to some extent, but on the river, and so much potential to kind of still deliver biodiversity value. And we were working with engineers and, you know, kind of planners and, you know, really not the sort of people who are going to have an imagination about biodiversity objectives. And so instead, what we did with them is that we sort of tried to design scenarios to think really creatively about what are the sensory experiences that you would like to feel and hear and sort of see and smell if you think that Fisherman's Bend is going to be developed really beautifully with kind of, you know, with nature, you know, considerations at its heart. And we got people to think through scenarios of taking their kids to soccer and getting an ice cream, or going for a job interview down a kind of, you know, thinking about how do you want this place to be when it's designed. And, you know, really interestingly, they came up with these as the key objectives for the site: a place that honours Indigenous culture, a place known by its diverse ecosystems, a place for the senses, a place of shifting waters, a place that's comfortable and beautiful in any weather. So they actually became the objectives for the whole site. And then we could link these objectives to how would you design the site for, what are some species that you could design for that would really start to deliver on some of these kind of human objectives, if you like. If you had habitat for growling grass frogs and you actually had shifting waters and diverse ecosystems, then, you know, that would actually be good for growling grass frogs and good for people. If you had streetscapes that had a diversity of vegetation, forms and structures and types, then you'd be maybe going partway there to getting superb fairy wrens back to the site. But it would also be a place for the senses and a place that, you know, would deliver on these other human objectives. And then you have to design, and this is a really clever stage where it's about linking designs to the things that we know species and ecosystems need. And I always say that there are three things: resources, threats, and connectivity. So when I say resources, I mean, you know, let's actually be a bit more creative about the plants that we use in our streetscapes. It just drives me absolutely bonkers how limited the planting palette is in our streetscapes in cities. You know, if you're going to have there'll be trees, again, limited diversity, half of them not even kind of native to Australia, let alone Indigenous to the local area. Certainly very little in the way of structural diversity. Let's actually, you know, mandate having kind of, you know, flowering native plants and having kind of a really proper kind of vegetation structure to streetscape planting. So really thinking about what if your objective is fairy wrens, what do they need in terms of the resources that you can deliver through vegetation? But then what do they need in terms of the vegetation you can deliver through habitat analogues as well? Can you have walls of buildings that are designed to be nesting cavities? Can you have rooftops that still deliver, you know, flowers for butterflies? Can you have bricks that allow birds to nest on one side and people to observe them nesting from the other side? This is really cool. Actually, architects are a great resource in all of this. But to be honest, their training has been, for the longest time, how do we keep nature out of cities? How do we make people safe by keeping nature away from us? That's really the kind of, in essence, the kind of their mandate. And they've, over the last decade, had to kind of really rethink that. And now we're demanding of them to design to bring nature back. But it's not natural, and it's a big shift in the way that they think. That's resources. Threats. How do we think about what's going to stop a fairy wren from actually being able to persist on this site? Well, one thing might be bird collisions to glass. And not that you see many fairy wrens colliding with glass, but birds on the whole do collide with glass. There are so many simple solutions to this. If you just slant glass downwards so that birds see the ground rather than the sky, they don't collide with it. You can easily put in retrofitted or bird-friendly glass. There's now, you know, products that you can buy for high-rise buildings to, you know, a kind of home renovation that means that birds will never strike your windows again. I do not know why this isn't completely mandated and necessary in every single, you know, house or building constructed in this country. Underpasses, I mean, roads are, you know, a bit catastrophic, but we can do them better. We know how frogs behave, and if you design an underpass really carefully, they will use it. If you design it not carefully, they won't use it. So you've got to know that they don't like to go into places they can't see out the other end. You know, you have to think like a frog, I suppose. You need to know they like a little bit damp, but not too wet. I don't know. They need to be kind of funneled in, otherwise they'll just hop on the road. So all that's threats. You know, there's all sorts of other things that you can consider. There's lighting. We know now the type of spectrum, the light spectrum that is a threat to birds, or to not to birds, to moths and bats, and well, to moths and other kind of nocturnal species, and the ones that are kind of actually much safer to use. Let's just use those spectrums of lighting, or shaded lighting is another kind of approach. And then there's kind of the connectivity. So resources, threats, connectivity. So for Fisherman's Bend, yes, they have, you'll always be drawn to kind of thinking about, you know, big projects, green spines and parks or riverside vegetation and the like. And yes, they're core to all of this, but you know, to get that everyday nature experience, you need to think about connectivity in the streetscape as well. And so we got them to think about how each street would be designed with this focal species in mind. How you're going to produce vegetation, habitat analogues, reduce the threats to them in every single street of Fisherman's Bend, and help them, you know, come up with designs for every kind of context. And then I think this is the step that we're probably most familiar with, and that's evaluating our designs. So you might want to use things like population viability analysis. We've done this semi-effectively, I think, in a few different housing development sites now. Or you can just use expert opinion, expert elicitation, you know, sophisticated expert elicitation, so that you have bounds around, you know, your estimates and the like. Or, you know, you can use literature reviews if there's really, it depends on your capacity to kind of deliver on this. But we kind of are pushing for more and more complexity as the kind of gold standard, I suppose. Or connectivity, that's another thing that we did certainly for Fisherman's Bend, is we kind of showed how the species would be affected by different designs in terms of the level of connectivity that would be delivered. Am I running out of time, guys? Can I keep going just for 5 more minutes? 5, perfect.
You can. I think we have about 10 minutes before a bunch of people have to log off at 5 too.
Okay, yeah. All right, well, I'll finish up. So yes, then you can link all of those evaluations to, you know, ideally quantitative estimates of how likely things are to persist on the site. I think ultimately though, we need to change our thinking as ecologists to understanding that people are going to be a big part of the problem and the solution, both, you know, in cities. And so designing so that you're going to encourage positive stewardship interactions rather than negative interactions is really, really important. And actually, this is one of the things that you will hear again and again and again if you work in this space is, oh no, what about the leaves in the gutter? What about the stinky possums? What about the roots interfering with my infrastructure? Oh, fire risk. Oh, I know. Oh, safety. You know, this will be something that you will be bombarded with. What you need to come back with and say is that every single one of those concerns can be handled with careful design. And there are solutions to every single one of them. Safety, you know, in terms of people jumping out from a bush and you know, we know that if you create gravel paths that especially women can walk on, make sound, and they know that someone's behind them, that actually creates much greater sense of, so, you know, things like this. We know that fire risk can be actually managed through really careful design. All of these problems can be carefully thought of and designed for. And there are so many creative strategies for actually engaging people positively with nature. This is wildlife gardening, which a student of mine, Laura Moomore, you know, has been a great advocate of since finishing her PhD. It's a wonderful thing. It's better than going to a psychiatrist, one of her participants said. But the idea that you can purposely design your garden to be part of the solution. People want to be part of the solution to the biodiversity crisis. They desperately want it. They want to be part of a big picture, we are bringing this species back type initiative. And wildlife gardening is something the Victorian government has now officially designated a kind of a key priority for the state, which is really exciting. And so, you know, it's doable. I'm going to skip over that and quickly go to my last slide, which is really just to kind of highlight, I suppose, the multiple opportunities for creating biodiversity experiences in places that you just wouldn't have probably thought of before. We've got to think it's, yes, the big parks, the big reserves, the public places, the riversides are going to be really core vegetation and perhaps more important in some respects for biodiversity conservation. But these places, the roundabouts, the semi-private courtyards, the rooftops, the green walls, these are all places where we can deliver those everyday nature experiences that are going to be absolutely critical to creating resilient cities, but also for creating people. If we're not people, you know, this nature that we know they need to be. Thank you very much.